Welcome back to Strategic Dialogues, a series from the Stimson Center's Strategic Learning Initiative. I'm Dan Markey, a senior fellow with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Now, today, I am very pleased to be joined by Tong Zhao to discuss the impact of China's military modernization on the security environment in South Asia. By way of background, Tong Zhao is a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Nuclear Policy Program in Carnegie, China. Formerly based in Beijing, he now works in Washington with his research focusing on nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, nonproliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy. Tong, welcome to our program. It's great to have you here. I'm going to dive right in and begin peppering you with questions about which I know you've thought a great deal. If we think about this conversation, it's going to have several different parts just for our audience. We're going to talk a bit about the broader questions relating to China's nuclear modernization. Then we're going to talk a bit more specifically about South Asia-related issues, starting with the May 2025 India-Pakistan conflict and connect that back to China. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about Chinese perceptions of South Asia. So that's kind of our roadmap for today. So all things I know you know a great deal about, and I look forward to your thoughts. So let's begin with modernization on the nuclear side. For decades, China's had a relatively small nuclear arsenal. And of late, as I think all of our viewers and listeners would understand, it's been much more rapidly modernizing that arsenal. And according to the Pentagon, China appears to be on track to have over 1,000 nuclear warheads by the year 2030. So I'd like you to kind of looking at that basic point to give us a sense as to how you would summarize the main components of Chinese nuclear modernization efforts. And then beyond that, as we understand what's going on, why do you think it's happening? If you can give us a sense of the motivation behind this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dan. It's a real honor to be speaking with you. To give our listeners some background, for decades, China maintained a very small arsenal of about 200 or so nuclear warheads, according to foreign government assessments and open source research. Even as recent as 2019, the US government assessment was Chinese arsenal was still in the low 200s. And then by the end of last year, the number has reached to around 600 by DoD assessment. And as you said, the number is projected to grow further to 1,000 by 2030. So there has been a very fast expansion of the nuclear arsenal. And it is happening in a very comprehensive manner. Traditionally, China relied very heavily on land-based strategic nuclear weapons for deterrence, but now China is openly developing a nuclear triad capability. A major part of the current buildup consists of 3 new large sites of ICBM silos, intercontinental range ballistic missile silos. And altogether, these new silo-based ICBMs can easily add more than 300 ICBMs to Chinese nuclear arsenal. And depending on whether China will deploy one or multiple warheads on each missile, that alone can easily add hundreds of additional warheads to Chinese arsenal. And in addition to that, China is also adding more units to its road mobile ICBM forces, especially its DF-31AG and DF-41. And most interestingly, in the latest military parade on September the 3rd last year, China showcased an even more modern version of its ICBM force DF-61. And we really don't know much about what new capability this new ICBM brings about. Some speculate it could be a more heavily nerved version than DF-41, but looking at the outside appearance, the two types of ICBMs look exactly the same. And in recent decades, China has been steadily improving its sea-based nuclear deterrence, currently deploying around six nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, the 094 class. According to US assessment, it is being retrofitted with a longer range version of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And with that missile, China might be able to reach US homeland from its coastal waters, especially from waters in the Yellow Sea, in the northern part of China, around near the northern part of Chinese coast. And China apparently is also making important progress towards researching the next generation nuclear submarine, the 096 class, potentially with better quieting capability, which comes with greater survivability and credibility. And also interestingly, China is introducing an airborne leg of its nuclear triad, and China showcased the world's first air-launched ballistic missile last year. So it gives China more options to attack targets as near as Guam and as far as Hawaii and maybe even the US homeland. So that's very, I think China is, pushing to comprehensively modernize its entire nuclear triad, partially because it simply has more resources. And the Chinese leader appears to attach a lot of geopolitical value to a larger Chinese nuclear arsenal.
So just picking up on that point, on this question of motivations, you would cite the Chinese motivations as they have the capability to do this. So there's a kind of a natural presumption that with that capability, states like China will do so, as well as a kind of is it signaling, or what is the other principal motivation, or is this really a concern about deterrence? How do you understand that?
I think China's own nuclear philosophy never excluded a further numerical growth of the arsenal. But China refrained from doing that for a long time because of economic resource constraint and the lack of a strategic need. But now in recent years, I think both conditions have changed. China has many more resources and also better technology. And China has developed a greater sense of a strategic threat, especially when US-China relations worsened since especially around early 2010s. The leadership in Beijing apparently believed that China needed to accelerate the development and demonstration of a strategic military power because they believe the US only recognizes power, that only by demonstrating greater strategic power, China could compel the United States to accept the reality of rising China and to give up, for Washington to give up on trying to contain China, and therefore to compel US and its Western allies to better respect Chinese core interest. And Xi Jinping himself pointed to the example of Russia by saying that Russia made the right decision to maintain a large nuclear arsenal, implying that the leadership saw broader strategic value in demonstrating nuclear capability, and believe that it could somehow influence Washington's overall approach in dealing with China.
Fascinating. So, yeah, I want to come back to some of this issue of how China thinks about the utility of nuclear weapons in a bit. But I have one other sort of small question for somebody like you that is deeply involved in this study of Chinese nuclear forces. You mentioned the DF-61 and questions about what it actually is, and you mentioned the parade. And I imagine, I don't do this type of work. I'm curious, uh, as you're spotting and watching during a parade, are you trying to take notes and figure out what you think you see there? I presume others are. A lot of the open source, what we think we know about China's nuclear arsenal seems to come from the Pentagon, which is obviously using other sources and methods for collecting intelligence on Chinese force modernization. For someone operating in the open literature, how are you doing that? How do you make sense of this stuff?
I personally do not do much direct open source research on Chinese nuclear capability simply because of the political sensitivity.
Uh-huh.
But there are other international researchers who are less vulnerable
Yeah.
to the security consequences of doing that type of research, and they have been using open source information, and it's the independent international experts who used commercial satellite imagery to
Hmm.
firstly discover China's construction of new ICBM silo sites. And they are also doing a lot of amazing work tracking the expansion of China's nuclear warhead production facilities, conventional explosive testing facilities, and also Chinese efforts to maintain its only nuclear testing site at Lochner at a very active level, including active drilling activities and digging and maintaining of new tunnels at the site. So all of those open source research findings, I think, offer a lot of interesting insight into what China is doing regarding its nuclear modernization.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's important work. It's interesting to think about how hard it is to do. Coming back to some of the points you identified a number of ways in which China is modernizing its arsenal, but one of the ones that stands out that you haven't spoken a lot about yet is on the sort of the small yield nuclear capabilities, described in the latest Pentagon report as below 10 kilotons. Um, and if we take the point that China has historically seen nuclear capabilities as less about warfighting and more about political signaling, should we see this development, what appears to be, I mean, we worried a lot about this in a different context in South Asia and Pakistan, tactical nuclear capabilities, seem to signal the idea that they were building these for battlefield use, warfighting doctrine. So how are we supposed to understand this in the Chinese context?
I think if we closely study China's military writings, it's clear that, again, in China's traditional nuclear philosophy, they never exclude the potential need to develop so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Uh, if you recall, during and after China's border clash with the Soviet Union in the 1960s, China developed at least two types of tactical nuclear warheads, or at least it's China may not fully completed the development, but China made real efforts to develop two types of low-yield nuclear warheads plus the neutron bomb, which is another type of tactical nuclear weapon. And apparently at that time, during the 1970s, the Chinese leaders genuinely believed there is a necessity to have these tactical nuclear warheads to fend off potential Soviet invasion. Um, but after after the Cold War started to move away from the most dangerous period, China-U.S. relations improved, China-Soviet relations normalized. Um, the immediate need for tactical nuclear weapons reduced. And in the 1980s, that's when the Chinese military, especially the Second Artillery, which was the former name of the Chinese missile forces, they started conducting a systemic study into Chinese nuclear strategy. And military writings at that time already indicated that China, at least the military strategists, they were aware that China's traditional policy of relying on massive retaliation, which means even if China was attacked with a limited nuclear attack, China would conduct a massive retaliation against the enemy's homeland. And Chinese military strategists recognized that this strategy was effective in deterring a massive nuclear attack, but might not be very credible to deter limited nuclear attack. But in following decades, they didn't make real efforts to address this deterrence gap. It was only later, and also with economic resources becoming further available, we saw China taking incremental steps to strengthen its so-called theater range nuclear forces with medium-range missiles, for example, that are increasingly precise and therefore enable China to conduct limited and targeted retaliation against military facilities without causing massive civilian collateral damage. So that would give China the capacity to conduct in-kind or proportionate nuclear retaliation, especially after a limited nuclear strike on China. And that capacity would be more credible to deter limited nuclear threats. In recent years, the US has also re-emphasized tactical nuclear weapons primarily because of the perceived Russian escalate to de-escalate nuclear doctrine. But that American effort to re-emphasize tactical nuclear weapons was read in Beijing as US wanting to focus again on nuclear warfighting and lowering the threshold of nuclear use. So that further, I think, prompted Chinese efforts to improve its tactical nuclear capabilities. So in other words, I think China is now, the military is now developing a more explicit interest in capability that can help China manage nuclear escalation if the nuclear threshold was ever crossed.
Right, right. Manage that escalation after the threshold has been crossed, but also, in their view, establish a more credible set of capabilities to deter, even at that lower level of use.
Indeed, if China could demonstrate greater capability to manage nuclear escalation, it would, at the same time, contribute to deterrence and making U.S. or other Chinese enemies less likely to use even limited nuclear attack on China in the first place.
Right. Certainly in their perspective. And that takes me to a question about how China thinks about certain concepts. And this could be a much longer discussion, but there's been frustration in Washington about how China appears to think about arms control and how China appears to reject certain kinds of conversations with Washington, nuclear dialogues, and so on. seems to see the world very differently from how kind of the arms control community sees these issues. I'd be curious what you make of that. Part of the argument, as far as I understand it, is that China has traditionally seen arms control as kind of directed against it as a means of keeping it down, not as a means of strategic stability, a tag word that we often use. Um, is this still true? Is this an accurate characterization? And how might China learn maybe different lessons going forward?
I'm afraid the traditional view on arms control is still dominant within China's expert community. And they think uh, US effort to include China in nuclear arms control is to constrain China's legitimate capability development. It is to give US a better asymmetric advantage. It is to lock in US superiority. And they believe that it is impossible to have a fair arms control negotiation if you have one party that has superior capability than the other. The stronger party could always strong arm the weaker party into accepting unfair and unequal arms control agreements. That view is still very deeply embedded, but it doesn't mean um, the thinking is monolithic in China. In fact, after China's opening up, many Chinese experts have increasingly learned from Western literature and Western experts who genuinely believe that arms control measures, confidence building measures, transparency measures are very important to build basic confidence, to reduce unnecessary risk, to avoid misunderstandings. And those notions, I think, increasingly persuaded many Chinese experts to start appreciate the value of cooperative security measures, including arms control. And we have also seen increasing interactions and collaborations between China and many other countries on arms control technology research. I'm sorry, arms control verification technology research. Even today, the Chinese Academy of Engineering Physics, the Chinese equivalent of the American nuclear labs, is still investing a lot into researching arms control verification technologies. So the experts community's views are more diverse,
Hmm.
and there are some occasional voices calling for China to reflect on its traditional reluctance against arms control. But I have to say those are still minor voices because the Chinese leadership right now appears to hold a very strong view on the importance of accumulating power, which is driving China's nuclear buildup. As long as that mindset, that belief that is power that brings China greater respect, gives China more opportunity to be treated equally, then it is hard for the experts' interest in arms control policies to become government policy.
So that core group of actual Chinese political leadership policy, which dominates policy, not the expert community, are there ways in which having more conversations about these issues with those from the outside, again, at that senior level, might begin to shift attitude? Or you would say, no, they're basically impervious. They have a kind of a mindset that's built in. It's going to be very difficult to shake them from this.
I think the theory of change
Hmm.
in promoting arms control is always to work simultaneously at the leadership level and at the broader expert level. And that's why I think it has been very helpful for the US leaders, including President Biden and President Trump,
Hmm.
who both made efforts to directly raise the issue of nuclear stability and even arms control with their Chinese counterpart, even though it doesn't appear to have made a huge difference so far. At the expert level, the hope is always that we could socialize ideas of arms control and transparency to Chinese experts. And if they are on board, they could then internally influence domestic debate, and if that eventually shift leadership thinking, because ultimately, especially when it comes to more technical issues, the political leadership has to rely on advice and policy memos from the experts as important input to their thinking. But one practical challenge today is the Chinese system has become much more secretive. This becomes further hardened as a result of US-China major power competition. There is much greater concern in Beijing about any dialogues potentially leaking national secrets to international rivals. So there is just less willingness for Chinese experts to join international dialogues. And even for those who are still willing to talk, the internal compartmentalization and the increasing marginalization of Chinese experts from closed door, secretive nuclear decision-making process also means the Chinese interlocutors are often uninformed about China's nuclear thinking and policy decision-making. So that makes expert discussion harder to be substantive.
Absolutely. Yeah, the closed nature of the system makes it very hard, not just to influence it, but even understand the nature of the debates that are happening within it. And that leads me to one of the observations that you've had about what you take to look like features of a launch under attack kind of system that China may be building, or a capability. Some describe it as launch on warning or launch under attack, but the points are similar. I wonder if you could just simply start by describing what you mean by that for our viewers and listeners, and why you think it's happening, why it may matter.
So launch on warning is the capability of using early warning systems, including infrared satellites in outer space and large ground-based phased array radars to detect incoming enemy missile strike. And therefore, to give the political leadership the opportunity to make a decision about whether the leadership wants to immediately launch a nuclear retaliation before the incoming enemy nuclear warheads could detonate over Chinese territory and destroy many Chinese nuclear weapons. Historically, I think China is apparently building the technical infrastructure for a launch on warning option. It already has a relatively functioning early warning system in space and on the ground. And China has openly claimed it is now putting a portion of its missile forces on combat-ready alert status in peacetime. And some, retired Rocket Force senior researchers also said China already had the capability to immediately launch retaliation minutes after receiving an early warning. This is a good example of a different type of nuclear learning, because China traditionally criticized U.S. and Soviet adoption of launch on warning as a very dangerous nuclear posture because of the risk with false alarm caused by technical glitches or human operator errors. And such incidents happened multiple times throughout Cold War, luckily without triggering a real nuclear crisis. But I think eventually the Chinese military was persuaded by watching US and Russia nuclear policies and decide and believed that this capability is something that a major nuclear power needs to have. And operationally, it also gives China a better capacity at deterring surprise disarming nuclear first strike. So this launching warning could deter the worst type of comprehensive disarming strike against China.
Remarkable development, as it appears to be happening, with implications for stability, as you pointed out, exactly the kinds of things that China said were problematic about U.S. and Soviet policy now come back. I want to shift gears now, though, to more of the South Asia side of things. First, by bringing India into our story. So, and broadly, to observe, we had a different scholar, an Indian scholar of nuclear issues, Raji Rajagopalan, do a segment for us recently. And she's done a study of Indian attitudes about Chinese nuclear modernization and potential Indian responses to that. The grave concerns that some Indian experts and even policymakers may have about what China's modernization means for India. And I wonder, whether it is right to connect the dots here. Everything that you've told us so far about China's modernization really is a US facing activity. And yet, as many of us have pointed out over the years, there seems to be a kind of maybe a cascading proliferation relationship between the United States and China, but also between China and India, and then onward between India and Pakistan. So it looks from a kind of a academic perspective that all these things are linked. But I wonder from your perspective and what you know about the Chinese thinking here, whether India's concerns, the potential Indian responses factor into Chinese thinking at all. Is that present or absent from Chinese perspectives?
I think it's safe to say that China's nuclear deterrence is always against multiple potential rivals, and India is definitely one of them. But I think for Chinese strategists, they regard it as relatively easy to deter Indian nuclear threats, especially given the ongoing Chinese nuclear expansion. China's nuclear deterrence is increasingly assured, even against America's much larger nuclear arsenal. I think there is greater confidence that with today's nuclear capabilities, China is in a better position to deter other minor nuclear threats. And especially China has better theater range nuclear forces, DF-26 missile, for example, and some of these missile units are deployed to regions closer to the border with India. So they could play a very useful role in a military contingency as a strategic deterrence. So I think there is, I think Chinese strategists are closely, of course, monitoring India's own development of nuclear and strategic capabilities, but they often do not connect the dots regarding how China's nuclear modernization and build-up may be influencing and shaping India's nuclear policy. I think this has been a traditional view in Beijing, which is India's nuclear pursuit has its own internal motivations. It is to fulfill India's own ambition to become a regional a dominating power. Um, and India needed nuclear weapons not because of concrete security threats from China, which means China tends to dismiss India's threat perception toward China.
Mm.
But they tend to think India's nuclear ambition was more driven by nationalistic need or need for national prestige. So they don't think what China does regarding nuclear buildup would necessarily affect India. Um, so for Chinese strategists, I think that's one reason they don't talk about nuclear chain reaction relationship among the three countries, China, India, and Pakistan. And they tend to have still uh, um, very low interest in having a nuclear focused dialogue with India.
It's fascinating and also just reflective of the broader, I would say, asymmetries in the India-China relationship, where India does have two eyes on China. China is looking in other directions as well, and so India may be a lesser and included case, which is rather easily dealt with in terms of capabilities and deterrence, but not necessarily a factor in Chinese planning, a factor that would change them or lead them to worry about being provocative toward India in their activities in ways that India sees as provocative, or some Indians perceive as provocative. Along similar lines, now shifting though away a bit from some of the nuclear story and more deeply into kind of crisis management. You know, in May 2025, just this past May, we had this remarkable conflict between India and Pakistan. And there were claims afterwards from senior Indian defense officials that China was pretty actively involved in that conflict. I mean, we already know that China sold weaponry to Pakistan that Pakistan made good use of, jets and missiles and so on. But there is this claim of live input during the crisis itself, which is remarkable, and which in some views would make China more of an active belligerent in that conflict. I wonder what you make of those claims now with some months of hindsight.
Um, I think there were, I think, Indian claims of China appearing to have reallocated some of its intelligence collection assets, including satellites, to reposition the satellites more directly towards India. So China apparently, oh no, according to Indian claims, were made efforts to in a targeted manner to collect military intelligence during this crisis, even though it is less clear that was for China's own use and situation monitoring, or China actively shared that intelligence with the Pakistan partner. But there were also, interesting Chinese accounts from personnel inside Pakistan saying that there are Chinese personnel on the ground, working overnight to coordinate with their Pakistani colleagues. Um, Maybe there were a supporter staff from China's state-owned weapons companies who provided Pakistan with Chinese arms, and they were there to support Pakistan's operational use of Chinese hardware, because eventually the Chinese arms companies have an inherent interest, and they knew it very well,
Hmm.
that this would be a real combat test of Chinese hardware, and China needed to appear perform very well. So I think they had incentives to provide extensive tactical support uh, uh, to maximize the military utility of Chinese arms. And
Mm.
indeed, I think there were evidence of um, China's air-to-air missiles, the PL-15, and China, experts were very proud of the beyond visual range capacity of such missiles, openly claiming that the outrange the Indian counterparts and even European technologies. There were, Pakistan purchased HQ-9 and other air defense systems. And there were reported interception of
Mm.
Indian, even the BrahMos missiles, which were a very important Indian modern capability. And also there were reported interception of Indian drones. Um, so I think overall, China achieved its goal. It might have provided tactical support, communication, maybe intelligence, um, and they felt this was worth the effort since China now can better market Chinese arms, weapons, and military technologies to a broader international market. And I think strategically, China starts to appreciate the capability to provide more substantive military support to allies. Because again, China has always been, following the footstep of other leading military powers. The U.S., one major source of U.S. geopolitical influence is U.S. capacity to provide intelligence, targeting information, etc. Types of tactical military support to allies, and that carries a lot of geopolitical influence. I think China starts to appreciate that, and especially in South Asia. Even though, as I said before, China does not necessarily recognize the nuclear strategic chain relationship among China, India, and Pakistan, but China certainly recognizes the broader security
Mm.
triangular dynamics. And China can certainly leverage its tactical military intelligence support to Pakistan to shape and influence Indian behaviors, especially since China has a broader strategic interest in making sure India wouldn't undermine China's core interest. India wouldn't, collaborate or collude with the United States to cause trouble on China's Western front when China was trying to focus on the eastern direction regarding Taiwan and South China Sea. But of course, as you mentioned, I'm sure China is also very careful in avoiding being viewed as a co-belligerent in a crisis, China wanted to avoid risks of being entrapped in a Pakistan-dominated escalation cycle. But overall, I think there is increasing discussion in Chinese expert writings about the necessity for China to be more openly and explicitly provide positive security assurances to allies as an important tool for China to develop as a rising major power.
The remarkable and very difficult balancing act, in a sense, for China to simultaneously demonstrate its commitment and the benefits of its partnership to Pakistan, while also attempting to tone down its conflict with India and to reduce tensions and frictions with India over the past few months. And it has managed, it seems, to walk that line pretty effectively, to take credit for the benefits of or for some of Pakistan's successes without taking so much credit that it does become a co-belligerent and ruin any prospect of a closer relationship or a less tense relationship with India. Um, in my own view, I believe that each of the three are motivated to accept that narrative, but for different reasons. India also wants a marginally less hostile relationship with China, so is willing to both blame China for Pakistan's successes, so that Pakistan doesn't come out looking too good, um, without accusing China, because it's walked back some of that language of accusing China of being too helpful to Pakistan. And Pakistan wants to take credit for a lot of its successes and not have China steal all the credit. And as we've said, China wants to have it both ways. So fascinating dynamic. We'll see if it can hold up. Um, I would be curious now, in a few minutes that we have left, to shift gears even a little further to some other related issues. And one of those is this remarkable announcement of a Pakistan-Saudi defense pact. And we haven't talked about Saudi Arabia or the Middle East at all yet, but clearly China has, over the past decade or so, really tried to do more in the Middle East and has, over longer than that, cultivated a better relationship with Saudi Arabia. So anything that the Saudis do with Pakistan, and of course we've already described Pakistan being so important in certain ways to China, that relationship being a critical one. Anything that would happen between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, obviously, you'd think it'd be being watched very closely in Beijing, and yet it's still less clear to me how it's being interpreted. So I wonder if you're hearing anything about that, about its significance or meaning through the Chinese lens.
Yeah, I think, of course, given the physical sensitivity and the lack of detailed information of this development, there hasn't been much
Hmm.
public Chinese commentary, but I do see some Chinese experts' analysis which portrays this development in a positive manner, because at the strategic level, they see it as a further development towards a broader multipolar world, because this demonstrates traditional US allies now wanting to reduce their reliance on the United States for security and wanted more other options independent from the United States. For China, that appears to be a positive development. And I think one consequence of this Saudi-Pakistani bilateral security pact is potentially elevated role of Pakistan in the Gulf region.
Hmm.
And I think that would also be welcomed by China, not least because of increasingly closer China-Pakistan political security relationship, to have a close ally, expanding its influence and connections in the strategically important Gulf region is beneficial to Beijing. And Pakistan's use of Chinese arms in the May conflict with India already played a hugely helpful role in marketing Chinese weaponry. And it's not just a single pieces of Chinese arms, it's a network
Hmm.
of Chinese military hardware and software, right? It's a capacity,
Yeah.
so it can increase the overall appealingness of China to export individual weapon systems, but also the data links and the software, the whole package. I think through Pakistan's advocacy, China may hope to further expand its arms market in the Middle East. Also, at least if Pakistan could sell more of the jointly developed JF-17 fighter, China could become an indirect beneficiary of that relationship.
Interesting.
I think again, given Pakistan's greater security role vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, and given China becoming an increasingly important security guarantor for Pakistan, I think that eventually makes Beijing believe it also has a greater security influence in the Gulf region. With that bilateral cooperation, one immediate calculation is, will the nuclear component of the cooperation lead to greater or reduced nuclear proliferation risk? I think that's not very clear to Beijing right now. On the one hand, it could lead to reduced proliferation risk because now Saudi can be covered by some type of Pakistani nuclear umbrella. And Pakistan, arguably doesn't have the perfect track record in preventing nuclear proliferation. But on the other hand, it could, increase the risk of Saudi developing hedging nuclear options if Pakistan again was less careful in sharing its own nuclear technology. So it can go both ways, and I don't think Beijing has concluded whether that risk is going to become greater or less. But that's a topic that Chinese strategists are, very keenly monitoring.
Remarkable. Let me just push you just very briefly. The way you just described the nature of China's views on that topic sounds like an interested bystander more than an invested and influential partner. But presumably, Beijing is quite invested and influential in both Islamabad and maybe to a lesser extent in Riyadh. Do you have any reason or do you have any thoughts about the extent to which Beijing was caught by surprise or even consulted, approached in the context of this defense pact? Or do you think, like many of us, they woke up and read it in the news that day?
To be honest, it's also hard for me to tell.
Yeah.
There is simply not much Chinese discussion of that. Well, of course, China had been aware of the long-standing rumor that there was some secret mutual understanding between the two countries that Pakistan's nuclear capability could provide a security benefit to Saudi Arabia if necessary. So I wouldn't say China was totally caught by surprise, but whether Beijing predicted the timing of this mutual agreement, that's uncertain to me.
Got it. Got it. Well, let me bring our conversation to a close by thanking you, Tong. This has been enlightening and useful along a wide range of fronts, and I think all of our listeners and viewers will agree. I want to thank everyone for watching this episode of Strategic Dialogues. If you want to learn more about strategic issues in Southern Asia, I encourage you to check out our suite of free online courses and resources at stratlearning.org. And let us know if you have any thoughts or feedback on the show. And stay tuned since we'll be back next month with another conversation here on Strategic Dialogues.